Picture a woman in ancient Greece. She's been trying to have a child for 3 years. No period again this month, so she goes to the physician. Everyone in her part of the city trusts. He sits her down, looks her over, and delivers his professional diagnosis. Her uterus has come loose inside her body. It's drying out. It's wandering. Right now, it might be pressing against her lungs, which is why she's been short of breath. And the treatment he prescribes, a real documented piece of medical practice we're going to get into in detail later, is going to involve smell. That's all I'll say for now. That's not a joke I wrote. That's Hippocratic medicine. That was the actual answer a real grieving woman was given by the most respected doctors of her era. I know a topic like this might feel heavier than what you usually click into, especially if it's touched your life directly. This isn't going to be a video that makes light of that. What it is the story of something almost nobody has ever told properly. What happened to the people history left out of the record entirely. Because here's the thing. For as long as people have existed, some of them have wanted children and couldn't have them. That's not a modern problem. It's not a footnote. It's one of the oldest, most private griefs a person can carry. And every civilization we're about to visit had to answer the same question in its own way. What do you do, and who are you, when the thing you're not supposed to have to explain doesn't happen? We're going to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. We're going to find out what people actually did when a child didn't come, the arrangements they made, the doctors they consulted, and exactly how that wandering womb theory came to be treated as settled science. First, let's get one thing straight. Infertility is not something ancient people whispered about and ignored. In Mesopotamia, it was written into law. Around 1750 BCE, the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving legal codes on Earth, includes a specific provision for exactly this situation. If a wife could not bear children, she was permitted to provide her husband with a servant to bear a child in her place. The resulting child was legally recognized as the wife's own. That's not folklore, that's statute. Carved in stone, literally, for anyone in the kingdom to read. Sit with that for a second, because it's a direct ancestor of something we still do today. Modern surrogacy, with contracts, legal parentage, all of it, has a documented legal precedent nearly 4,000 years old. The instinct to solve this problem through arrangement, not shame, is ancient. Now, this wasn't some tidy, humane system. The servant in question had no say in the matter, and Mesopotamian law is clear that she remained a servant even after bearing the child. So let's not romanticize it. But structurally, it tells us something important. This society didn't treat childlessness as a mystery to suffer through in silence. It treated it as a problem with a legal fix. That's a strikingly practical response for 4,000 years ago. Adoption ran alongside this, and the paperwork survives to prove it. Mesopotamian tablets record formal adoption contracts, actual legal documents specifying inheritance rights, care obligations in old age, even financial penalties if either party backed out later. Some tablets go into remarkable detail. The adopted child is guaranteed a share of the estate equal to a biological child, and in return is bound to support the adoptive parents in old age, the same obligation a birth child would carry. If you couldn't have a biological heir, you could build a legal one, on paper, with the full backing of the state to enforce it. There's also evidence Mesopotamians tried to treat infertility medically, not just route around it legally. Surviving medical texts prescribe herbal remedies, ritual offerings to fertility deities like Ishtar, and specific dietary instructions meant to warm a woman's body, which physicians believed was necessary for conception. None of it worked the way they thought it did. But the sequence, try the remedy, try the diet, try the prayer, and only then fall back on the legal option, should feel familiar. That's not so different from the order most people try things in today. So Mesopotamia gives us bureaucracy layered over ritual, layered over medicine. Cold in places, occasionally harsh, but recognizably a system trying to solve a real problem with every tool it had. And that's worth holding on to, because it means the starting point for this whole story is more advanced than you'd expect. Mesopotamia wasn't groping around in the dark. It had contracts, protections, and a diagnostic vocabulary for talking about this. But it still hadn't really answered the question underneath all of it. What do you do, and who are you, when it doesn't happen? Which makes what happens next even stranger, because the next stop is a civilization that, on paper, was smarter, more scientifically rigorous, more philosophically advanced by almost any measure we'd use today. And it's going to somehow produce a theory about the human body that is, genuinely, harder to believe than anything Mesopotamia came up with. Egypt starts off almost charmingly practical. One of the oldest known pregnancy tests comes from an Egyptian medical text called the Berlin Papyrus, and it goes like this. A woman urinates on 2 bags of grain, 1 wheat, 1 barley, over several days. If the wheat sprouts, it's predicted to be a girl. If the barley sprouts, a boy. If neither sprouts, no pregnancy. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. Modern researchers actually tested this method in a lab, and germination rates were significantly higher when the urine came from pregnant women, likely due to elevated hormone levels affecting the grain. It wasn't perfect science, but it wasn't nothing either. 3,500 years before the first drugstore pregnancy test, someone in Egypt had stumbled onto something real. Egyptian medicine went further than testing for pregnancy. It also tried to diagnose infertility itself, using a method that sounds strange but followed a kind of internal logic. Physicians would have a woman sit over a bowl of specially prepared substances, sometimes involving beer or incense, and observe her body's reaction. Vomiting, in particular, was read as a sign that her body was open and capable of conceiving. It's not medicine by any modern standard, but it's a diagnostic test with a control, a procedure, and a recorded outcome. Egypt was, in its own way, trying to run something like a clinical exam 3,500 years before the concept existed. And once Egypt hands the baton to Greece, the tone shifts fast. Because Greece is the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and geometry. And it is about to produce a theory that makes Egypt's urine-on-grain method look like a peer-reviewed clinical trial by comparison. Here's the setup. Greek physicians in the Hippocratic tradition needed to explain why a woman couldn't conceive. Here's the build. They landed on the idea that the uterus wasn't fixed in place at all, that it could dry out, get restless, and go looking for moisture elsewhere in the body, drifting up toward the liver, the lungs, sometimes even the throat. Here's the punchline. The actual medical term for this condition is where we get the word hysteria, meaning, quite literally, doctors spent centuries treating a huge portion of women's medical complaints as an organ having what amounts to a temper tantrum and relocating. And the prescribed treatment follows the logic through to its full, bizarre conclusion. Physicians would hold foul, unpleasant smells, burnt substances, strong herbs, near the woman's mouth and nose, while placing sweet, pleasant scents near the vagina. The theory, the wandering womb, repelled by the stench above and drawn toward the fragrance below, would migrate back down into place. And the fumigation approach wasn't the only technique on offer. Some physicians also recommended what's now called vaginal fumigation, burning specific substances beneath the woman while she sat over the smoke, believed to travel upward and coax the errant organ back into position from below. Others prescribed marriage itself as a cure, on the theory that a dried-out, wandering womb was calmed simply by regular intercourse. In this framework, an unmarried woman's body was considered inherently more prone to the condition, which meant the treatment for a medical complaint frequently doubled as a tidy justification for controlling who she married and when. Let that sink in. This wasn't a folk superstition passed around by people with no education. This was the formal medical consensus, taught and practiced by physicians who were otherwise laying the groundwork for Western medicine as we know it. And it gets worse once we bring in Aristotle. Aristotle proposed that in reproduction, the man supplied the active, form-giving element, essentially the blueprint for a new person, while the woman supplied only raw, passive material. Under this framework, when conception failed to produce a child, the assumption fell overwhelmingly on the woman's body being defective, her material insufficiently cooperative with the man's contribution. A theory built entirely by men that just so happened to conveniently clear men of any responsibility. Genuinely, what are the odds? Here's the through line worth keeping in your head for the rest of this video. Two of the most intellectually advanced civilizations of the ancient world could hold a stunningly modern, functional grasp of the body, like the grain test, right next to a theory as detached from reality as a roaming uterus being chased around with smells. The wrongness wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was intelligence pointed with total confidence in the wrong direction, at real people's expense. And notice what's still missing from every theory so far. Not one of them asked what the woman living inside this diagnosis actually needed. They were all answering a different question than the one that mattered. But philosophers writing scrolls in Athens and Alexandria were not the ones actually living with this. So let's set the theories aside for a moment and ask what childlessness actually cost a person, day to day. And here, the gap between rich and poor gets brutal fast. If you were a wealthy man in the ancient world and your wife could not conceive, you had options, and society backed every one of them. In Mesopotamia, as we covered, you could formally take a servant to bear an heir. In many parts of the Greek and Roman world, elite men could take a second wife or a concubine specifically to produce children, while facing essentially no social penalty. Your lineage, your property, your name, all protected, one way or another. If you were a poor woman, none of that existed for you. There was no servant to offer, no second household, no legal workaround. If you didn't produce a child, the consequences landed on you directly, and they were severe. In multiple ancient legal systems, childlessness was grounds for a husband to divorce his wife outright, with her having little to no recourse. And children weren't just emotionally important, they were a woman's entire retirement plan and safety net. No children meant no one legally or practically obligated to care for you when you grew too old to work. That wasn't cruelty on top of grief. That was the actual, material stakes of it. Rome sharpens this even further. Roman law under Augustus actually penalized childlessness directly. The Lex Papia Poppaea imposed real financial and inheritance restrictions on unmarried and childless citizens, while rewarding those with multiple children with legal privileges, including priority in public office and reduced restrictions on inheritance. The state didn't just have opinions about your family, it had a tax policy about it. And once again, wealth built an exit ramp that poverty didn't have. A wealthy Roman family with the right connections could petition for the ius trium liberorum, special legal privileges normally reserved for parents of 3 children, as an honorary exception, essentially buying their way around the very penalty the law was designed to enforce. Emperors granted these exemptions to favored citizens, senators, even entire categories of professionals. An ordinary citizen with no such connections simply paid the cost the law demanded, year after year, with no path around it. So across 2 entirely different civilizations, separated by 1,000 years and an ocean, the same pattern holds. Money didn't remove the pain of infertility, but it built a wall around the consequences that the poor simply did not get. If you were rich, this was a problem you could route around. If you weren't, it could unravel your entire life. And while wealthy households were arranging concubines and lobbying emperors for exemptions, ordinary women were doing what ordinary people have always done when official medicine offers nothing, turning to folk practice. Across the Greek and Roman world, archaeologists have found small votive offerings, clay models of wombs, breasts, and infants, left at temples by women praying for conception, alongside inscriptions thanking the gods for finally answering that prayer. These weren't symbolic gestures for the wealthy elite. They were cheap, accessible, and left in enormous numbers at healing sanctuaries, used overwhelmingly by people who had no physician on retainer and no legal workaround available to them. A votive offering cost almost nothing. It was in a real sense the only tool a poor woman actually had. That gap, a servant contract and a legal exemption for the rich, a clay offering and a prayer for everyone else, is the truest measure of what this experience actually cost, depending entirely on the household you were born into. But there's a piece of this that cuts across class entirely, and it's easy to miss if you only look at contracts and legal codes. Naming. In several ancient cultures, a woman's entire social identity was built around motherhood, almost from the moment she married. Some Roman epitaphs for women list little else beyond whose mother or whose wife she was. A woman who never had that title wasn't just missing a role. In the eyes of her own community's record-keeping, she risked being missing from the story altogether. No inscription, no title, nothing carved down to say she existed. Rich or poor, that particular erasure didn't check your bank account first. Here's a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people. The first baby conceived through in vitro fertilization wasn't born until 1978. The first over-the-counter home pregnancy test didn't reach shelves until 1977, meaning for the vast majority of people who have ever lived, the grain test in ancient Egypt was, functionally, the most advanced version of that technology that would exist for another 3,500 years. In the full sweep of human history, modern reproductive medicine is not even a blink ago. It's closer to the very last frame. For essentially all of the time humans have existed, there was no clinic to walk into, no diagnosis to receive, no procedure with a success rate printed on a pamphlet. There was only the version of an answer your civilization happened to hand you: a legal contract, a grain test, a clay offering left at a temple, or a stranger with a medical degree confidently explaining that your organs had gone wandering off in search of a pleasant smell. And maybe that's the thing worth carrying out of this one. Every era we walk through today believed, with complete conviction, that it understood this. The Mesopotamians thought they'd solved it with a contract. The Egyptians thought they could read it in a bowl. The Greeks thought they'd solved it with a scent. Aristotle thought he'd solved it by simply deciding, in advance, whose fault it would always be. None of them had actually solved anything. They were reaching for an explanation for something that deep down they didn't control, because that not knowing is unbearable, and people will build almost any structure, legal or medical or philosophical, rather than sit inside it with nothing. Remember the questions sitting underneath all of it. What do you do, and who are you, when it doesn't happen? Every civilization answered with a different structure: a contract, a diagnosis, a law, an offering left at a temple, because a structure is something you can hold. What none of them ever managed to build was an answer to the actual question. Not one era, in 4,000 years of trying, figured out how to make the not knowing hurt less. They just got better at building things around it. What none of those structures could do, in any era, was touch the actual feeling underneath them, the wanting, and the waiting, and the not knowing why. That part was never really about wombs or contracts or grain. It was just people, in every century, hoping for something they couldn't control. That part hasn't changed at all. Only the structures built around it have.